In this presentation, we're going to look at looping in Python. So we want to be able to repeat code. Sometimes we have something that is a piece of code that needs to run a specific number of times. So anytime we want to do something repeatedly, then we want to be able to repeat that code without having to write it again and again and again. So that's called a loop, is when we repeat our code. It can also be called an iteration. So in Python, we have two different looping structures. The first is a for loop, and the second is a while loop. With the for loop, whenever we know exactly the number of times we want our code to loop or execute or iterate, we're going to use a for loop. And a while loop has a condition. So while a condition is met, then it's going to loop that code. So the condition is checked before the loop, the code inside the loop ever executes or runs. So this is called a pre-test loop. Let's look at the for loop first. Again, you can use the for loop to iterate or loop through lists or ranges. So if you know that you need something that's going to go through an entire list, as in the very first example, where I have the breeds and I created a list of just 3 dog breeds, and then for dog in breeds, so it's going to look at dog as a variable for each element that is within that list, and it'll print the dog, and then you can see below where the output is. Now, here's another example. Sometimes we want to use a range. We may want to ask the user, how many times do you want this to happen, and then we can use that variable to create a range. So whenever we want to use a range of numbers, we can use the range function, and that's going to create a list of numbers for us, just like we had the list previously. It has a starting variable, a stopping variable, and then a step variable. The step is not required. However, if you want it to do something other than 1, you need to put it in. So if my starting point in my example is 0 and my stopping point is 10, I'm going to create a range from 0 to 10, and I want it to step by 2. So essentially my range is going to be 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8. Don't forget that the stop does not include the that last number. So if I actually wanted to include 10, I would need to have 11 there. Now, I'm going to sum all the numbers that are within that range. So I'm going to create next a variable, and that variable is going to be called sum, and I'm going to initialize it to 0. That gives it a starting value. And then I'm going to say for num in sum nums, so for each element in my range, I want to use an accumulator statement next, sum equals sum plus num. There are ways that you can shorten that with, like sum plus equals num, which is fine, or you can certainly write it out the way that I did. So that's going to take each num within that range that we created, and it's going to add it to sum and then reset the value of sum each time. Once that is done, then I am going to just print the sum, and it's 20. So 0, 2, 4, which is 6, 8, 6, yes, So 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8 will give me 20. Okay, for the while loop. The while loop, again, works differently than the for loop because it's using a condition. So if the condition is true, then it wants to do whatever is inside the loop. So if the condition is false, so say I initialized number to 0 and my condition was if number is greater than 0, then do this stuff. It's false, so it's not going to do what's inside the loop. So remember, conditions are Boolean expressions that always evaluate to either true or false. You're going to use things like equivalent, which is the equals sign. You're going to use things like greater than, less than, not equal to. All of those you're going to use in your Boolean expressions. Now, you may also need a counter inside the loop. Say you wanted to do something a certain number of times. So while the counter is less than 10, you want it to iterate. If you don't add a counter variable that's going to increment inside, then you're going to end up with a loop that never ends, and that's called an infinite loop, and that will lock up your code. So counter variables are used to count the number of times a loop has iterated or looped or run. You may have it where somebody's going to do some input and you need to know how many times they've input. You would want to have a counter in there. So it helps the computer to know where it is in the loop. And a lot of times we'll use, as programmers, variables called I, then J or K. Those are very common names for counter variables. You can also just use count or counter. Now, how to increment that counter. You can increment or increase or decrement, which is decrease, your counter variable in any of these ways. So I equals I plus 1 is the same thing as I plus equals 1 or I plus plus. You can do the same thing with negatives. When you do something like I plus plus or I minus minus, it automatically increases or decreases by 1. So if you need to do something other than 1, you'll have to use the first or second way. So you can do something like I equals I plus 2 or I plus equals 2, or you can use I plus equals 5 or whatever's appropriate. You can also do things like I times equals 2 if you need to do something like maybe a factorial. Okay, so let's look at an example of a while loop, and this is just a simple one. So I've got some input, so txt, which I did for text entered, equal to input, would you like to play a game? And then while that text entered is equivalent to yes, and because it's in double quotation marks, it's a literal string, and it has to be capitalized and spelled exactly like what's in that string, so it must be lowercase. Notice you have the double equal sign. If you had put just one equal sign, it's actually used for assignment, so it would be saying text entered is equal to yes, not while text entered is equivalent to yes. So make sure that you always use that double equal sign when you're checking it for equivalency. So I've got print, great, and then get the text input again. If I wanted to add a counter in here, I could have said count equals count plus 1, and then that would tell me how many times the loop iterated as well. So there is the output from that. So here's another example using an accumulator, a counter, and then again getting a number entered. Notice that at the very top, I always put some comments telling what my code is about. And then I've created some variables. So I created my sum, my num entered, and my count. And I initialized them all to 0. then I have num entered equals input, enter a positive number. So in my loop, I've got while int num entered. So whenever you've got input, enter a positive number, whenever you have this getting input, it always comes in as a string, as text. So to make it a number, I'm going to put int and parentheses around the variable so that it turns it into an integer. So while the number entered is not equal to, which is the exclamation equals, -1, then I want you to add num entered to the sum, and sum is already a number because I had done that at the top. I'm going to add 1 to the counter so that I know how many numbers were entered, and then I'm going to ask again to enter a positive number so that it will continue the loop until a -1 is entered. And then I print it out. Again, notice that with the printing, I've got the concatenation symbol, the plus sign, between each string and variable so that it binds it together. And then around my numeric variables, I have the string function, which allows me to concatenate that number. Then on the right side, you see my output, and you can see where I entered the -1. And notice that I'm actually checking. I did enter a total of 15, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that was 5 numbers, and the average is indeed 3.0. I coded this in repl.it in Python 3. This is a very easy online IDE, and you're more than welcome to use it if you would like to. All right, so let's look really quick at a nested loop. And I'm going to run this while I'm talking about it. So what I did, and good, it's just going to keep running. So what's happening is in my procedure, it's a procedure because it does not return anything. What I did is for each row, and you can see the way that it's output, and I'll run that again. So for each row, it's going to add each star in each column, and then it'll print it out. So print, it's going to print the row, and then it clears the line, and this is just the variable that I'm using. And then the column is going to add each asterisk to the string. And then I've got a time.sleep with an important time here. And all that's doing is it's slowing it down so that it's easier for you to see. And then I'm printing the line. Notice the print is at the same level as the column. If I had the print inside here, it would print each one. But I'm adding a string because I'm adding it to a string and then printing that string because I don't want it printing out a long list of asterisks. I want it to build the string first and then output it. And then I have my call. So let me run that again for you one more time so you can see it. So row 1, adding the stars and then outputting it. Row 2, adding the stars and then outputting. 3, building the string, output. And then 4, building the string and the output. So hopefully this has helped you with the 2 types of loops in Python. Don't forget, you can always ask questions.